Section 4 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr Natter. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 9, by Charles F. Horn, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Negro Slavery in America, A.D. 1517, by Sir Arthur Helps. In 1442, the first Negro slaves were imported into Europe. They were taken from Africa to Portugal in ships of Prince Henry the Navigator. From that time there was little traffic in Negroes until after the discovery of America. Then there was great destruction of American Indians by war, disease, and killing work, and the importation of Negroes into Spanish America was begun in order to fill the void in the labour market. Influenced by the spirit of Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish monk, celebrated as the defender of the Indians against his own countrymen who conquered them, the monarchs of Spain prohibited Indian slavery. It is a very significant fact that the great protector of the Indians, Las Casas, should, however innocently, have been concerned with the first large grant of licences to import Negroes into the West India Islands. We first hear of the introduction of Negro slaves in those islands through the instructions given in 1501 to Nicolás de Ovando, who in the following year succeeded Columbus as governor. During the 9 years of his governorship, Negro slavery in the Spanish possessions of the New World was greatly extended. A few years later, as shown by Helps, official licence gave it a legal sanction. Helps's account begins with an abstract of Las Casas' memorials to the King of Spain looking to a remedy for the bad government of the West Indies. The outline of Las Casas' scheme was as follows. The King was to give to every labourer willing to emigrate to Hispaniola his living during the journey from his place of abode to Seville, at the rate of half a real a day throughout the journey, for great and small, child and parent. At Seville the emigrants were to be lodged in the Casa de la Contratación, the India House, and were to have from 11 to 13 maravedis a day. From thence they were to have a free passage to Hispaniola, and to be provided with food for a year, and if the climate should try them so much that at the expiration of this year they should not be able to work for themselves, the King was to continue to maintain them. But this extra maintenance was to be put down to the account of the emigrants, as a loan which they were to repay. The King was to give them lands, his own lands, furnish them with ploughshares and spades, and provide medicines for them. Lastly, whatever rights and profits accrued from their holdings were to become hereditary. This was certainly a most liberal plan of emigration, and in addition there were other privileges held out as inducements to these labourers. In connection with the above scheme, Las Casas, unfortunately for his reputation in after ages, added another provision, namely, that each Spanish resident in the island should have licence to import a dozen Negro slaves. The origin of this suggestion was, as he informs us, that the colonists had told him that, if licence were given them to import a dozen Negro slaves each, they, the colonists, would then set free the Indians. And so, recollecting that statement of the colonists, he added this provision. Las Casas, writing his history in his old age, thus frankly owns his error. This advice, that licence should be given to bring Negro slaves to these lands, the Clérigo Casas first gave, not considering the injustice with which the Portuguese take them and make them slaves, which advice, after he had apprehended the nature of the thing, he would not have given for all he had in the world. For he always held that they had been made slaves unjustly and tyrannically, for the same reason holds good of them as of the Indians. The above confession is delicately and truthfully worded, not considering, he does not say not being aware of, but though it was a matter known to him, his moral sense was not watchful, as it were, about it. We must be careful not to press the admissions of a generous mind too far, or to exaggerate the importance of the suggestion of Las Casas. It would be quite erroneous to look upon this suggestion as being the introduction of Negro slavery. From the earliest times of the discovery of America, Negroes had been sent there. But what is of more significance, and what it is strange that Las Casas was not aware of, or did not mention, his Hieronymite fathers had also come to the conclusion that Negroes must be introduced into the West Indies. Writing in January 1518, when the fathers could not have known what was passing in Spain in relation to this subject, they recommended licences to be given to the inhabitants of Hispaniola, or to other persons, to bring Negroes there. From the tenor of their letter it appears that they had before recommended the same thing. Suazo, the judge of Residencia, and the legal colleague of Las Casas, wrote to the same effect. He, however, suggested that the Negroes should be placed in settlements and married. Fray Bernardino de Manzanedo, the Hieronymite father, sent over to counteract Las Casas, gave the same advice as his brethren about the introduction of Negroes. He added a proviso, which does not appear in their letter, perhaps it did exist in one of the earlier ones, that there should be as many women as men sent over, or more. The suggestion of Las Casas was approved of by the Chancellor, and indeed it is probable there was hardly a man of that time who would have seen further than the excellent Clérigo did. Las Casas was asked what number of Negroes would suffice. He replied that he did not know, upon which a letter was sent to the officers of the India House at Seville to ascertain the fit number in their opinion. They said that 4,000 at present would suffice, being 1,000 for each of the islands, Española, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Jamaica. Somebody now suggested to the Governor, de Bresa, a Fleming of much influence and a member of the Council, that he should ask for this licence to be given to him. De Bresa accordingly asked the King for it, who granted his request, and the Fleming sold this licence to certain Genoese merchants for 25,000 ducats, having obtained from the King a pledge that for 8 years he should give no other licence of this kind. The consequence of this monopoly enjoyed by the Genoese merchants was that Negroes were sold at a great price, of which there are frequent complaints. Both Las Casas and Pasamonte, rarely found in accord, suggested to the King that it would be better to pay the 25,000 ducats and resume the licence, or to abridge its term. Figueroa, writing to the Emperor from Santo Domingo in July 1500, says: "Negroes are very much in request. None have come for about a year. It would have been better to have given de Bresa the customs duties, that is, the duties that had been usually paid on the importation of slaves, than to have placed a prohibition. I have scarcely a doubt that the immediate effect of the measure adopted in consequence of the Clérigo's suggestion was greatly to check that importation of Negro slaves, which otherwise, had the licence been general, would have been very abundant." Before quitting this part of the subject, something must be said for Las Casas which he does not allege for himself. This suggestion of his about the Negroes was not an isolated one. Had all his suggestions been carried out, and the Indians thereby been preserved, as I firmly believe they might have been, these Negroes might have remained a very insignificant number in the general population. By the destruction of Indians, a void in the laborious part of the community was being constantly created, which had to be filled up by the labour of Negroes. The Negroes could bear the labour in the mines much better than the Indians, and any man who perceived that a race, of whose Christian virtues and capabilities he thought highly, were fading away by reason of being subjected to labour which their natures were incompetent to endure, and which they were most unjustly condemned to, might prefer the misery of the smaller number of another race treated with equal injustice, but more capable of enduring it. I do not say that Las Casas considered all these things, but at any rate, in estimating his conduct, we must recollect that we look at the matter centuries after it occurred, and see all the extent of the evil arising from circumstances which no man could then be expected to foresee, and which were inconsistent with the rest of the Clérigo's plans for the preservation of the Indians. I suspect that the wisest among us would very likely have erred with him, and I am not sure that, taking all his plans together, and taking for granted, as he did then, that his influence at Court was to last, his suggestion about the Negroes was an impolitic one. One more piece of advice Las Casas gave at this time, which, if it had been adopted, would have been most serviceable. He proposed that forts for mercantile purposes, containing about 30 persons, should be erected at intervals along the coast of the Tierra Firma, to traffic with merchandise of Spain for gold, silver, and precious stones. And in each of these ports ecclesiastics were to be placed, to undertake the superintendence of spiritual matters. In this scheme may be seen an anticipation of subsequent plans for commercial intercourse with Africa. And indeed one is constantly reminded by the proceedings in those times of what has occurred much later and under the auspices of other nations. Of all these suggestions, some of them certainly excellent, the only questionable one was at once adopted. Such is the irony of life. If we may imagine superior beings looking on at the affairs of men, and bearing some unperceived part of the great contest in the world, this was a thing to have gladdened all the hosts of hell. Section 5